So in 1967, there was a miracle called the Six-Day War. And after the Six-Day War, we had the Coastal Maravi, the Western Wall, and the old city of Jerusalem, and the city of Hebron, and the entire West Bank was in the hands of Israel, the hands of Jews, to whom the land actually belongs. Hebron was never an Arab city. Neither was Shechem, which now they call Nablus, but its real name is Shechem. Mount Gerizim and Mount Eval, which are in Samaria, belong to the Bnei Yisrael. That's where Joshua made a pact with the people of Israel to keep God's commandments. In fact, they found the original altar where that covenant was made 3,300 years ago. It was found by a man by the name of Professor Adam Zertel, wrote a book about it. And of course, the left tried to destroy Adam Zertel, saying that he was currying favor with the right-wing rabbis. Adam Zertel was as secular as they were, except he was an honest broker, an honest scholar, who said he had found Joshua's altar. So the area around Nablus, the area around Shechem, Jewish land, has nothing to do with the Arabs. At any rate, we got the land back with a miracle. Everybody said it was a miracle, except for the Satmar Rov. The Satmar Rov wrote a book called Al Agula V'Al Atmura, in which he posits that miracles can only happen through the hands of people who are pure and holy, people who keep the Sabbath, people who keep kosher, people who are sexually restricted according to the Torah, don't engage in fornication, and keep the family purity laws. The soldiers of the IDF were not known to be so observant. So how could they have been the channels for God's miracle, he said. Instead, he said, the victory came through the Sitra Achra, the other side, strengthening the prestige and the power of the seculars, the ones who are anti-Torah. The same thing happened 9 years later when the miracle at Entebbe took place. You all know the story. Yoni Netanyahu took a group of soldiers over 4,000 miles into the airport in Entebbe, and an incredible, brave act done with complete silence and surprise. The Israelis attacked the airport, pulled out 99% of the hostages. There was one or two hostages that died. One who had been in a hospital, another who had picked up her head and was hit by stray bullet fire. And of course, Yoni Netanyahu was shot and killed by one of the Ugandan soldiers. But all in all, the hostages were going to be shot and killed. The terrorists were all killed, and Israel got back their hostages whole, almost without any kind of issues. And this, the world saw, was a miracle, except, of course, the holy Satmar Rebbe, who again said that this had been done by the IDF, and they could not be the channels of a miracle. So the Rebbe opposed this and brought proofs that God can format a miracle through people who don't believe. For example, when a person is deadly ill, We all know that the cure of a person who's in danger is in the hands of God, and yet when we go to a doctor, it makes no difference as to the religiosity of the doctor. The greater the expert, that's the one we go to, despite the fact cures come through the Rebbeinu Shalom, through God. And a person who is cured from a deadly ill has to say a blessing. He says that at the Sefer Torah. It says it blessing with God's name, despite the fact that his doctor doesn't believe in God. And that's the doctor that he chose to go to because he's the bigger expert. And in fact, the rabbis all universally said, you go to the biggest expert. You don't go to the person with the biggest payas when we're talking about a doctor. That's the case with the doctor. Same thing is true with people who extricate hostages. You go to the people who are expert at the process of saving hostages, which are soldiers. Soldiers who were taught stealth, taught how to deal with weaponry, taught how to deal with terrorists, how to engage in surprise attack, and to extricate people from being held hostage. So the miracle took place despite the fact that they were non-religious. So I want to go ahead and expand on that. We said that there were 5 kinyonim, 5 things that God bought. Now, why does God have to buy anything? He made it. He created it. What does it mean that God bought those things? God acquired those things. One of them is Israel, the other is the temple. And they are next to each other, despite the fact you could say that this is in chronological order. First he bought Israel, then he bought the temple. At the end, it's not because of the chronology, it's because they're close to each other. Why does God have to buy a temple? The temple is dedicated for God. All the sacrifices are for the sake of God. The Kohanim do their service in God's name. The blessing of the Kohanim, the blessing of the priests, are all in God's name. Why does God have to buy the temple? It was dedicated for God's worship. The answer is that there are things in the temple that are not so kosher. But I will illustrate using something that's obvious to everyone. There was a little budka, a little booth in the temple, maybe 15 by 15, maybe a little bit larger, called the Beis HaMitbachayim. Beis HaMitbachayim translates at the place of the butchering, the butcher shop. What was the function of the Beis HaMitbachayim? Well, there was a spring, water, that went through the Beis HaMitbachayim and flowed through it. And had some tables and had hooks where you could put animal carcasses. You hung them, you cut them up, and you took out the kishkas, you took out the innards, and you washed out all the innards from their dung. Now, dung has a word for it, which we won't say, but it's dung. It's excrement. And it stinks. And sometimes there were hundreds, and sometimes there were thousands of animals that had to be washed. And sometimes tens of thousands that had to be washed. All washed with the waters of the spring that went through the Beis HaMitbachayim. They had to clean out all those animals' innards. And you can imagine how much it stank. And one could say the Beis HaMitbachayim did not belong to God. It was a place of dung, a place of stinking. You can't even pray there where it stinks. How can you say that this is God's? Yeah, a place where you offer the sacrifice onto the altar, the place where the priests pray, the place where people confess their sins, the place where the high priest enters, the place where you offer the incense on a daily basis. You could say those places are God's, but a Beis HaMikdash, the butcher shop, with all of its excrement and stinking, how could God's presence be there? You can't even utter a word of blessing there. You can't utter Torah there. It stinks to high heavens. Literally. And when we say God bought the Beis HaMikdash, he bought all the Beis HaMikdash, including the Beis HaMikdash, including the place that stank where you're not allowed to go ahead and say a blessing. And if a Jew would enter the Beis HaMikdash and he was impure, he had violated the sanctity of the temple, despite being in a Beis HaMikdash, which you could call a house of excrement, because of the abundance of all of those sacrifices, the excrement that's being taken out. But because it's in the temple, it's part of the temple service, it's holy, and a Jew who is impure, who hasn't gone to mikveh, who hasn't waited his time, hasn't been sprinkled with the water and the ashes of the red heifer, cannot enter there. And if he enters, curtains, terrible things happen. So the Beis HaMikdash is sanctified despite what goes on in it. And it belongs to God, same way as the Holy of Holies. Among Jews, there's the Holy of Holies. Rabbi Yoel was one of them. He was one of the holiest Jews that lived in our times. And there's the Beis HaMikdash. There are Jews who parallel the Beis HaMikdash, a butcher shop. And it may stink. And the function there is less than stellar. But despite being less than stellar, God bought all of the Jewish people, not just part of the Jewish people. And since God says, this person is mine, every Jew who calls himself a Jew, who is halachically Jewish, belongs to God. And God's presence is upon that person, either openly or concealed. And therefore miracles can take place, just as the holiness of the temple rests upon the Beis HaMikdash, the butcher shop. The holiness of God rests upon every Jew, no matter his station in the spiritual world. And yes, miracles can happen, even if they don't follow the rules, especially since they really don't know any better. And that's what this Mishnah in Pirkei Avos teaches us. God bought us, all of us, every last one of us. And every one of us is sanctified by God with God's stamp. And every one of us is capable of performing miracles.